I was staring at the certified letter in my hand when my entire world tilted sideways. The words "Notice of Adverse Possession Claim" jumping off the page like they were mocking me. The Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, led by their president Patricia Whitmore, was claiming they now owned my family's cabin in the mountains near Breckenridge, Colorado, a property that had been in my family for 3 generations. My name is Isaac Irving, and I had inherited the cabin from my grandfather 2 years ago when he passed away at the ripe age of 92. The cabin sat on a beautiful 5-acre plot about 15 miles outside of Breckenridge, nestled among towering ponderosa pines with a crystal-clear stream running through the back of the property. My grandfather had built it with his own hands in 1978, and it had been our family's retreat from the chaos of Denver ever since. I visited it at least once a month, sometimes more during ski season, and I had meticulous records of every single visit, every utility bill, every property tax payment. The letter claimed that the HOA had been maintaining and occupying the property for the past 7 years, and therefore under Colorado's adverse possession laws, they were now the rightful owners. I read it 3 times, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. 7 years. That was a complete fabrication. I had been there just 2 weeks ago, and before my grandfather passed, he had been visiting regularly until his health declined about 3 years before his death. I grabbed my phone and called my lawyer, Marcus Chen, who I had used for the estate planning when I inherited the cabin. He picked up on the second ring. "Marcus, it's Isaac. I need you to look at something immediately. The HOA near my cabin is trying to claim adverse possession." There was a pause on the other end. "That's a pretty bold move. How long are they claiming?" 7 years. "But Marcus, that's impossible. My grandfather was using the property until 3 years before he died, and I've been using it constantly since I inherited it. I have documentation for everything. Bring me every piece of paper you have. Utility bills, receipts, photos with timestamps, anything that proves continuous use and ownership. Colorado requires 18 years for adverse possession claims, and that's only if specific conditions are met. If what you're saying is true, they don't have a legal leg to stand on." I drove to Marcus's office in downtown Denver that same afternoon, carrying 2 bankers' boxes full of documentation. I had property tax receipts going back to 1978, utility bills, credit card statements from the local hardware store and gas station, dated photographs, and even a detailed log my grandfather had kept of every visit, meticulously noting the date, who came with him, and what maintenance he performed. Marcus spread everything across his conference table, his dark eyes scanning document after document. After about 30 minutes, he looked up at me with a grim expression. "This is either incredibly stupid or incredibly corrupt. You have ironclad proof of continuous ownership and use. There's no way they meet the requirements for adverse possession. In Colorado, they would need to prove open, notorious, exclusive, adverse, and continuous possession under a claim of right for 18 years. They're claiming 7, which isn't even close, and your documentation clearly shows you and your grandfather were actively using the property. So what do? We respond aggressively. I'm going to draft a cease and desist letter today, and we're going to threaten legal action for slander of title. If they're doing this maliciously, we might even have grounds for fraud charges. But first, I want to understand what they think they're doing. Do you have any history with this HOA?" I shook my head. The cabin isn't even part of their jurisdiction. It's outside the HOA boundaries. My grandfather specifically bought the land before the development went in because he didn't want to deal with HOA nonsense. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. Wait, your property isn't even in the HOA. No, the Whispering Pines development was built in 2005, about a mile down the road. My property is completely separate. This gets more interesting by the minute. Let me do some research on the property lines and HOA boundaries. Something doesn't add up here. Over the next week, Marcus dug deep into the county records while I tried to focus on my work as a software engineer, though my mind kept drifting back to the cabin. I had so many memories there. Learning to fish with my grandfather in the stream, family barbecues on the deck, teaching my nephew how to identify different types of pine trees. The thought of losing it to some bureaucratic land grab made my blood boil. Marcus called me on a Thursday evening. "Isaac, you need to come to my office tomorrow morning. I found something and it's not good." Well, it's not good for them, but it's very interesting for us. The next morning, I sat across from Marcus as he pulled up a series of documents on his laptop. Okay, so here's what I discovered. The Whispering Pines HOA has been trying to expand their boundaries for the past 5 years. They've been buying up adjacent properties to increase their assessment base and fund various projects. Your property sits right in the middle of a parcel they want to develop into a community recreation center. But they can't just take my property. No, they can't. But here's where it gets shady. About 7 years ago, right after your grandfather's health started declining and his visits became less frequent, the HOA started using a corner of your property for overflow parking during their summer events. I found photos on their Facebook page from various gatherings. They set up some picnic tables, mowed a section of your land, and basically acted like they owned it. My grandfather never gave them permission for that. I know, and that's the problem. They're trying to argue that because your grandfather was elderly and not visiting as frequently, and because you hadn't inherited the property yet, they were able to occupy it unopposed. But they're wrong on multiple fronts. First, even at his sickest, your grandfather was paying all the bills and taxes, which demonstrates ownership. Second, 3 years of occasional trespass doesn't mean anything when you need 18 years. And third, the possession has to be exclusive and adverse, meaning they can't share it with the actual owner, which they were doing since you and your grandfather continued to use the property. So why are they doing this? Marcus leaned back in his chair. My guess, intimidation. They probably figured you're a young guy who inherited property. Maybe you don't know the law. Maybe you can't afford a lengthy legal battle, so you'll just walk away. Or they'll offer to settle by buying it from you at a fraction of its value. It's a bullying tactic, and it's more common than you'd think. What's our next move? I've drafted a comprehensive response that we'll file with the county and serve to the HOA. We're demanding they immediately rescind their claim and issue a public retraction. If they don't comply within 10 days, we file a lawsuit for slander of title, trespass, and we'll seek damages. I'm also recommending we file a complaint with the Colorado Attorney General's office because this kind of predatory behavior towards property owners might be part of a larger pattern. I nodded, feeling a bit of relief that I had someone competent fighting for me. Do it. All of it. Marcus sent the response that afternoon via certified mail and email. Then we waited. The 10-day deadline came and went with no response from the HOA. On day 11, Marcus filed the lawsuit in Summit County District Court. 2 days after we filed, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this Isaac Irving?" a sharp, nasally voice demanded. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Patricia Whitmore, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I'm calling about your frivolous lawsuit against our community organization." I felt my jaw tighten. "Mrs. Whitmore, There's nothing frivolous about defending my property rights against a baseless adverse possession claim. You've been trespassing on my land and now you're trying to steal it. My lawyer has documented everything. Steal it. We've been maintaining that property for years while it sat abandoned. We've mowed the grass, cleared fallen trees, kept it from becoming an eyesore. If anything, you should be thanking us. First of all, it was never abandoned. I have proof of continuous ownership and use. Second, nobody asked you to maintain anything. You trespassed on private property without permission. And third, you don't meet even the most basic requirement for adverse possession. You need 18 years in Colorado, not 7. That's a technicality. We've invested thousands of dollars into maintaining that land. We've made improvements. Our community has used it for wholesome family gatherings. You barely visit once in a blue moon. I'm there at least once a month, Mrs. Whitmore. I have gas station receipts, restaurant bills, photographs with timestamps and utility records to prove it. Your claim is fraudulent, and if you don't withdraw it immediately, my lawyer is going to make sure this costs your HOA a lot more than whatever you spent on mowing a patch of my lawn. How dare you threaten me? I'm trying to do what's best for our community. That property could serve hundreds of families instead of just sitting there for your occasional weekend getaway. It's my property, Mrs. Whitmore. It's been in my family for almost 50 years. You have no right to it, no claim to it, and no business even setting foot on it. Withdraw your claim or see me in court. I hung up before she could respond, my heart pounding. I immediately called Marcus and recounted the conversation. Good, he said. Let her be aggressive. The more unreasonable she acts, the better it is for our case. Don't communicate with her directly anymore. All contact goes through me. The lawsuit slowly ground through the legal system. We had a preliminary hearing in July, about 2 months after I first received that shocking letter. The judge was a weathered woman in her 60s named Judge Sandra Kowalski, and she had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense. Marcus presented our evidence. The property tax records, the utility bills, my grandfather's meticulously kept logs, photographs with GPS data and timestamps showing me at the property multiple times per year, credit card statements from local businesses. It was overwhelming and irrefutable. The HOA's lawyer, a nervous young man named David Preston who looked fresh out of law school, tried to argue that my visits were sporadic and that the HOA had established open and notorious possession of a portion of the property. He presented photos of their summer barbecues and the picnic tables they'd set up. Judge Kowalski looked at him over her reading glasses. Counselor, are you seriously arguing that hosting a few barbecues on someone else's property without permission constitutes adverse possession? Your Honor, the property appeared to be abandoned. My clients were simply being good neighbors by maintaining it and preventing it from falling into disrepair. Except it wasn't abandoned. I'm looking at property tax receipts paid every single year without fail. I'm seeing utility bills for electricity and water. I'm seeing a detailed log of visits going back decades. I'm seeing time-stamped photographs. What I'm not seeing is any evidence that your clients had any legal right to be on this property at all, let alone claim ownership of it. Your Honor, Colorado law does allow for adverse possession after a certain period of continuous use. 18 years, Counselor. 18 years of open, notorious, exclusive, hostile, and continuous possession under a claim of right. Your clients are claiming 7 years, and even that appears to be exaggerated based on the evidence before me. This is one of the weakest adverse possession claims I've ever seen. The judge turned to Marcus. Mr. Chen, I'm prepared to grant your motion to dismiss the HOA's adverse possession claim right now. Is there anything else? Yes, Your Honor. We're seeking damages for slander of title, trespass, and legal fees. The HOA's false claim has created a cloud on my client's title, making it difficult or impossible to sell, refinance, or otherwise deal with the property. We're also asking the court to issue an injunction preventing any member of the HOA from entering my client's property without his explicit written permission. Judge Kowalski nodded. The adverse possession claim is dismissed with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled. As for damages, we'll need a full hearing with evidence of actual harm. I'm scheduling that for September 15th. In the meantime, I'm issuing a temporary injunction. No member of the Whispering Pines HOA is to set foot on Mr. Irving's property. If they do, they'll be in contempt of court. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor, both lawyers responded. As we left the courtroom, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder. That went as well as it could have. Judge Kowalski saw right through their nonsense. Now we just need to prove damages, and we can put this whole thing to bed. But Patricia Whitmore wasn't done. That weekend, I drove up to the cabin to check on things and put up some no trespassing signs as my lawyer had advised. When I arrived, I found that someone had dumped a massive pile of tree branches and yard waste right in the middle of my driveway, blocking access to the cabin. I took photographs from every angle, documented everything, and then called the Summit County Sheriff's Office. A deputy named Rodriguez arrived about 40 minutes later. "Looks like someone doesn't like you," he said, surveying the pile of debris. "It's the local HOA. We're in the middle of a lawsuit. They claim they owned my property through adverse possession, but a judge just threw out their claim. This feels like retaliation." Deputy Rodriguez walked around the pile, examining it closely. "Well, this is definitely illegal dumping on private property, and if you can prove it was the HOA, it might be criminal mischief or harassment. You got any cameras out here?" "No, but I'm installing some today. I ordered a whole security system after the lawsuit started." "Smart move. File a formal report, and if it happens again and you have video, we can press charges. In the meantime, you'll have to clear this yourself or hire someone to do it. The county will remove it, but they'll charge you for it." I spent the next 6 hours hauling branches and debris off to the side of the property. By the time I finished, my back was screaming and my hands were covered in scratches and blisters. But I wasn't about to let Patricia Whitmore and her cronies win through intimidation. The following week, a local tree service quoted me $800 to chip and remove all the dumped material. I paid it and forwarded the receipt to Marcus, adding it to our damages claim. True to my word, I also installed a comprehensive security camera system. 6 cameras covering the driveway, the main cabin, and the areas where the HOA had been trespassing. Everything uploaded to cloud storage in real time, so even if someone destroyed the cameras, I'd have the footage. I didn't have to wait long to test the system. 5 days after installation, my phone buzzed with a motion alert at 2 in the morning. I pulled up the camera app and watched as 2 figures in dark clothing approached my property line and started spray painting something on the trees that marked the boundary. I immediately called the sheriff's office while recording everything on my phone. The video quality was excellent, even at night, thanks to the infrared cameras. I could clearly make out one of the figures, and even though they were trying to hide their identity, I recognized Patricia Whitmore's distinctive gait and the sparkly sneakers she always wore. I had seen those shoes in enough photos on the HOA's Facebook page. The vandals fled before the deputies arrived, but I had everything on video. Deputy Rodriguez returned, this time with his supervisor, Sergeant Miller. "Mr. Irving, this is getting serious," Sergeant Miller said. "We've got clear video of vandalism and trespassing on your property. If you can identify these individuals, we can press charges." "That's Patricia Whitmore," I said, pointing to the screen. "She's the HOA president and the main person behind the adverse possession claim. See those shoes? She wears them all the time. Look at their Facebook page, you'll see them in dozens of photos." Sergeant Miller made notes. "And the other person, I can't tell from this angle, but Patricia Whitmore is enough to start with. We'll follow up with her tomorrow. In the meantime, document the damage to your trees. Take photos in daylight. This is criminal mischief, and combined with the illegal dumping, we might be looking at a harassment pattern." The next morning, I drove back up to the cabin to photograph the vandalism. In bright red spray paint, someone had written "thief" and "squatter" across 3 of my trees. I took dozens of photos, measuring the damaged areas and documenting everything. Marcus was delighted when I sent him the evidence. "This is exactly what we need." They're showing a pattern of harassment and retaliation. Not only does it strengthen our civil case, but criminal charges might push them to settle quickly to avoid the publicity. 2 days later, Deputy Rodriguez and Sergeant Miller visited Patricia Whitmore at her home in the Whispering Pines development. I wasn't there, obviously, but Marcus got a copy of the incident report later. According to the report, Patricia initially denied being on my property, but became agitated and uncooperative when shown the video footage. She then claimed she was inspecting the property because she believed it still rightfully belonged to the HOA, despite the court ruling. She was arrested and charged with criminal trespassing and criminal mischief. The second person in the video was eventually identified as Richard Whitmore, Patricia's husband, who was charged with the same offenses. The arrest made the local news. HOA president arrested for vandalism of property in ongoing dispute. Read the headline in the Summit Daily News. The article detailed the whole sordid story, including the bogus adverse possession claim, the illegal dumping, and the spray paint vandalism. The reaction from Whispering Pines residents was swift and brutal. The HOA's Facebook page exploded with comments from homeowners demanding Patricia's resignation. Many residents had no idea what had been happening and were horrified to learn their HOA fees might have funded this campaign of harassment against a private property owner. An emergency HOA meeting was called, and Patricia was voted out as president. The new interim president, a reasonable-sounding woman named Helen Diaz, called Marcus's office to discuss settlement. "We want to make this right," she told Marcus during their first phone call, which he had on speaker so I could listen. "What Patricia did was wrong, legally and morally. The board has authorized me to offer full compensation for all damages, legal fees, and a formal public apology." "That's a good start," Marcus said, "but my client has suffered significant harm here. There's the direct costs, of course, but there's also the emotional distress, the time taken away from his work and personal life, and the cloud on his property title that will take time to fully clear." "We understand. What are you looking for?" Marcus glanced at me. We had discussed this beforehand. $50,000 in damages, full reimbursement of all legal fees and expenses, a formal written apology published in the local newspaper and on all HOA communications, and a permanent easement document clarifying that Mr. Irving's property is completely separate from HOA jurisdiction, with a covenant preventing any future claims of any kind. There was a long pause. "That's a substantial amount. Mrs. Diaz, your former president, tried to steal my client's property through fraud, then engaged in a campaign of criminal harassment when that failed. She dumped trash on his land, vandalized his trees, and caused him months of stress and thousands in legal fees. $50,000 is quite reasonable considering we could pursue this through trial and potentially win much more. Let me talk to the board. Can I call you back tomorrow? Take your time. But know that if we don't reach a settlement, we're prepared to go to trial, and we'll be seeking significantly more in damages. We'll also be filing complaints with the Colorado Attorney General's office about the HOA's practices, which could trigger an investigation into all of your operations. That apparently lit a fire under the board. Helen called back 4 hours later. The board has approved your terms. We'll have the settlement agreement drawn up by our attorney and sent over for your review. The settlement took 2 weeks to finalize. The HOA's insurance company paid $40,000, and the HOA itself covered the remaining $10,000 plus all legal fees, which totaled another $18,000. The public apology ran in the Summit Daily News and was posted to every entrance of the Whispering Pines development. Meanwhile, Patricia and Richard Whitmore were prosecuted for the criminal charges. They both pleaded guilty as part of a plea agreement. Patricia was sentenced to 1 year of probation, 100 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution of $3,000 for the tree damage and cleanup costs. Richard received 6 months probation and 50 hours of community service, but the story wasn't quite over. During the discovery process in the criminal case, investigators found something interesting. Patricia had been using HOA funds to pay for a lawyer to pursue the adverse possession claim, which was a personal benefit and a misuse of association funds. Several homeowners filed a complaint with the Colorado Attorney General's office, triggering an audit of the HOA's finances. The audit revealed that Patricia had spent over $30,000 in HOA money on the adverse possession scheme and related legal fees, all without proper board approval. She had also paid herself consulting fees of $12,000 that weren't authorized in the HOA's governing documents. Additional criminal charges were filed, this time for theft and embezzlement. I watched the news coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. What started as an attempt to steal my cabin had unraveled into a full criminal investigation of HOA corruption. Marcus called me after the embezzlement charges were announced. I hope you're sitting down. The prosecutor wants to talk to you about testifying at trial. What? Why? I'm not involved in the embezzlement. No, but you're the victim of the underlying fraud that led to it. They want to establish the timeline and show that Patricia was willing to break the law to get your property, which goes to her intent and state of mind. It's powerful evidence that this wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping but deliberate criminal conduct. I ended up testifying at a preliminary hearing in December, 8 months after I first received that shocking letter. The courtroom was packed with Whispering Pines residents, many of whom were furious at Patricia for misusing their money and dragging their community's name through the mud. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Hughes, walked me through the entire timeline. When I described receiving the adverse possession notice and realizing someone was trying to take my family's cabin, I saw several jury members shaking their heads in disgust. Patricia's defense attorney tried to argue that she genuinely believed the property was abandoned and that she was acting in the HOA's best interest. But the evidence was overwhelming. Emails showed she knew my grandfather had owned the property for decades. Text messages revealed she had researched adverse possession laws and knew the 18-year requirement, but decided to file the claim anyway, hoping I wouldn't fight back. Bank records proved she had paid herself consulting fees without authorization. The trial lasted 3 days. Patricia was convicted on 2 counts of theft, 1 count of embezzlement, and 1 count of fraud. She was sentenced to 2 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections, though the judge said she'd be eligible for parole after serving 1 year. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and to me. Richard Whitmore, interestingly, divorced her before the sentencing. Apparently, discovering your wife is a criminal who nearly bankrupted your household is grounds for ending a marriage. I visited my cabin on the day Patricia reported to prison. It was a cold January morning, and fresh snow blanketed the pine trees. I stood on the deck my grandfather had built with his own hands, looking out at the mountains, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The legal nightmare was finally over. My property was secure, with ironclad documentation establishing that it was completely separate from the HOA and protected from any future claims. The settlement money had covered all my costs, and then some. And Patricia Whitmore was facing the consequences of her actions. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos of my grandfather that I kept. There was one of him standing on this very deck, holding up a massive rainbow trout he'd caught in the stream. He had the biggest smile on his face. I wished he was here to see how things had turned out, how I'd fought to protect what he'd built. But in a way, I felt like he was watching. He'd taught me to stand up for myself, to document everything, and to never let bullies push me around. Those lessons had served me well. My phone rang. It was Marcus. "Hey, Isaac, just got the final paperwork. The settlement is completely processed, the title is clear, and I've recorded all the protective easements with the county. You're officially done with this whole mess. Thanks, Marcus, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." That's what lawyers are for. Well, good lawyers anyway. What are you going to do now? I looked around at the cabin, at the land my grandfather had loved so much. I'm going to spend the weekend here, enjoy the peace and quiet, and maybe do some skiing. After that, I'm thinking about coming up here more often. Maybe even seeing if I can work remotely a few days a week. This place is too special to only visit once a month. Sounds like a good plan. You've earned some peace and quiet. After we hung up, I went inside and started a fire in the stone fireplace. The cabin was exactly as my grandfather had left it, with the same worn leather couch, the same shelf full of fishing magazines, the same framed photos of family trips and caught fish on the walls. I thought about how close I'd come to losing all of this. If I hadn't kept good records, if I hadn't hired a competent lawyer, if I'd been intimidated by Patricia's aggressive tactics, I might have walked away. The cabin might now be a community recreation center, my family's history paved over for picnic tables and volleyball courts. But I hadn't walked away. I'd fought, and I'd won. Over the following months. I did start working remotely from the cabin more often. The internet wasn't great, but it was functional, and my boss was flexible about my schedule as long as I got my work done. I found that I was actually more productive there, without the distractions of the city. I also became something of a local celebrity in the property rights community. Marcus suggested I write an article about my experience for a real estate law blog, and it went viral. I started getting emails from people all over Colorado and beyond who were facing similar situations with aggressive HOAs or neighbors trying to claim their land. I couldn't help everyone, but I tried to share what I'd learned, keep meticulous records, document every visit, every payment, every interaction, take photos with timestamps, save receipts. Don't assume good faith from people who are trying to take what's yours. And get a good lawyer early, before a bad situation becomes a nightmare. The Whispering Pines HOA, under new leadership, became one of the most professionally run associations in Summit County. Helen Diaz brought in a management company to handle the finances, implemented strict oversight procedures, and made transparency a priority. They even invited me to speak at one of their meetings about the importance of respecting property boundaries and rights, which was surreal but oddly satisfying. Patricia Whitmore served 11 months before being paroled. By then, I'd mostly moved on from the anger I felt during the worst of the conflict. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to Grand Junction to live with her sister and was working as a cashier at a grocery store. Her law license to practice real estate had been suspended, and she'd been blacklisted from HOA management in Colorado. I didn't feel bad for her. She'd made her choices, and actions have consequences. But I also didn't spend much time thinking about her anymore. My focus was on enjoying the cabin and honoring my grandfather's legacy. One afternoon in late spring, about a year and a half after the whole ordeal began, I was fishing in the stream when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see an elderly man with a walking stick making his way carefully down the path. "Hope I'm not intruding," he called out. "I'm James Davidson. I own the property about a mile north of here, been coming up here for 40 years. I knew your grandfather." I waded out of the stream. "Isaac Irving. Nice to meet you. How did you know my grandfather?" We'd run into each other at the hardware store, sometimes grab coffee in town. "He was a good man. I heard about your trouble with that HOA woman. Glad you fought her off. We've got to protect these places. There aren't many left where a man can have some peace and quiet without a committee telling him what color to paint his mailbox." We talked for a while about the area, about the changes over the years, about the balance between development and preservation. James told me stories about my grandfather that I'd never heard, adventures from before I was born. It felt like a connection to the past, a reminder of the generations of people who had loved this land. As James was leaving, he turned back. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, you know. What you did, standing up to them, that took courage." After he left, I cast my line back into the stream, watching the water flow over the rocks, constant and unchanging. My grandfather had stood here doing this same thing thousands of times. Now I was here, and someday, if I was lucky enough to have kids, they'd stand here too. That was worth fighting for. That was worth every stressful moment, every dollar spent on lawyers, every hour dealing with Patricia Whitmore's schemes. This land, this cabin, this connection to my family's past and future, it was priceless. The sun started to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. I caught a nice trout, released it back into the water, and headed back to the cabin. Tomorrow I'd drive back to Denver, back to my regular life. But I'd be back here in a week, and the week after that, and the week after that, because this was mine. Not because a court said so, though they had. Not because I had the paperwork, though I did. But because it was part of who I was, part of my family's story, part of something bigger than any property dispute or legal battle. Patricia Whitmore had tried to take that away, and she'd failed. The cabin still stood, the stream still flowed, and the mountains still watched over it all, just as they had for millions of years before any of us arrived, and would for millions of years after we were gone. I locked up the cabin that night and took one last look around before heading to bed. Everything was exactly as it should be. Secure. Protected. Home. The legal battle had taught me something important about America, about property rights, about the systems we have in place to protect people from those who would take what isn't theirs. Those systems aren't perfect. They're expensive and time-consuming and stressful to navigate. But they work if you're willing to fight, and I had fought. I had won. And now, I had the rest of my life to enjoy this beautiful place my grandfather had built with his own two hands, secure in the knowledge that no HOA president, no matter how entitled or aggressive, could take it away from me. As I drifted off to sleep that night, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant sound of the stream, I thought about the letter that had started it all. Notice of adverse possession claim. 3 words that had turned my world upside down for more than a year. But in the end, they were just words on paper, backed by nothing but Patricia Whitmore's greed and delusion. My claim was backed by decades of family history, meticulous documentation, and the law itself. There was never really any contest. The cabin was mine. It had always been mine. And it always would be. I slept better that night than I had in years, wrapped in blankets my grandmother had made in a cabin my grandfather had built, on land that would stay in my family for generations to come. Justice had been served, the bad guys had faced consequences, and everything was right with the world. Patricia Whitmore had gambled that I wouldn't fight back, that I didn't know the law, that I could be intimidated or outlasted. She'd lost that gamble spectacularly, and in the process, she'd lost everything. Her position, her reputation, her freedom, and her marriage. Meanwhile, I had gained something. Not just the settlement money or the legal victory, but a deeper appreciation for what I had. I'd learned to never take this place for granted, to document and protect it, and to stand up for what was rightfully mine. The next morning, I packed up and drove back to Denver. The whole way home, I thought about the journey I'd been on. From that first shocking letter to the final court victory, it had been exhausting and expensive and stressful. But it had also been worth it. As I merged onto I-70 and left the mountains behind, I was already planning my next visit. Maybe I'd bring some friends up, show them the cabin, tell them the story of how I defended it against an HOA that thought they could just take whatever they wanted. It was a good story. A story about standing up to bullies, about the importance of documentation and good legal counsel, about how the system can work when you're willing to fight through it. A story about family, legacy, and the land we inherit from those who came before us. And best of all, it was a story with a happy ending. The villain went to prison. The hero kept his cabin. Justice prevailed. I smiled as I drove through the Eisenhower Tunnel, leaving Summit County behind. The cabin would be waiting for me next weekend, and the weekend after that, and for all the years to come. Patricia Whitmore's scheme had failed completely, and my family's legacy was secure. That was all that mattered. Everything else was just noise.